Hello and welcome to the SAP on Azure Video Podcast. Today is January 21st, and together with Robert and Goran, we are here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Today we have a follow-up to a blog post that we talked about some time ago regarding deployments using Azure Files. And we have a Ralitza joining us today. But before we hand over to her, let's quickly take a look at some of the news from last week, or some of the topics from last week. And actually, let me just try to share my screen. That just didn't work on the first try. But now hopefully you can see my screen. So yes. I want to start with a blog from Bartosz. You might remember him. He was on the podcast some time ago, and he was quiet for a very, very long time, but now he finally picked up his series, Your SAP on Azure. Now we are on part 25, so he's really covering a broad range. And this time he's picking a very interesting topic about encryption on the database level, and especially here using the Azure Key Vault. So like HANA or SQL Server or whatever, they can support data encryption on a database level. Which is something that has been around for quite some time. But now Bartosz guides us through the steps of how to use this. I mean, in this case with SQL Server, but connecting your keys or storing your keys really in Azure Key Vault. So by this, and you know Bartosz, he has a very, very detailed blog and very detailed descriptions here. He guides us through the steps how to enable the encryption on SQL Server, but then really how to store the related encryption key in Azure Key Vault. So I think that's definitely something very interesting, and it's really good to see that Bartosz started blogging again. One other thing, he also mentioned that he switched his user on SCN or on the SAP community. So now if you followed the old Bartosz, now you need to follow his new username here. The next blog is also someone that we know, Martin Pankratz. We talked about one of his last blogs. I don't know, was it last week or a few
weeks ago,
episodes before, where he talks about setting up a failover scenario with the cloud, with CPI, with the integration services. And he got a lot of feedback there from partners, from customers. And now he has extended this scenario or changed this scenario in a way that he's now looking at Azure Traffic Manager. So here's an overview. So now in his new setup, he's actually using Azure Traffic Manager to work on failover scenarios between different CPI instances. So again, especially if you have looked at his previous blog here, I think that's a really nice addition and talks about leveraging some other components on Azure to get to this failover scenario. Then another blog from Ralf. You might remember Ralf from the I would call it the ANF trilogy, where we had Ralf on the show talking about Azure NetApp Files. At that time, he was obviously only talking about using Azure NetApp Files with HANA. And now he did a POC to run Oracle 19 on Azure NetApp Files. So as always, he also created a very, very detailed blog on how to get started, how to set up Azure NetApp Files, and then also how to deploy the Oracle database using Azure NetApp Files. So I think if you are an Oracle customer and if you have a big Oracle database, this is definitely also something that is worth checking out.
So if maybe just a small comment. So if you would check the SAP note, SAP on Microsoft Azure support prerequisite on the storage part, there's a section on Azure NetApp Files. So initially it was for the SAP application layer, then extended to HANA, and now it's extended for Oracle and Oracle Linux with
Okay.
this minimum. So meaning it's really stamped as an unofficially support statement. Yes.
But actually, you mentioned there a very interesting point, because Oracle Linux. So I think that is also pretty interesting and important to highlight, that if you run Oracle on Azure, you obviously have the choice with Windows, but if you run it on Linux, and if you want to run it in a supported way in the context of SAP, you need to run it with Oracle Linux.
Right.
You really have all the
and the another is also SAP application Microsoft Azure uses in Oracle database. The version only supported version is this 19C.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is the only, so meaning is the higher version.
Cool, great. Good. With this, these were the blogs that I wanted to highlight. Now some upcoming learning events, I would say. So the first one that I want to highlight is this Cloud Skill Bootcamp. It's an online event that will happen, 15th of February. And there's quite some interesting content there. So if you scroll down, you can see a lot of these webinars that focus on certain topics here, GitHub and Azure, or there was also some Azure fundamentals. But I mean, it's a broad range of webinars there. So I think this is definitely worth checking out as well. There are some interesting speakers. So Brendan Burns is one of the speakers there. So I think, this is, if you have time, if you're enjoying sitting in front of your computer more, then I think these boot camps here are certainly quite interesting. When it comes to SAP and Azure, we are starting a new series with partners, and the first partner that we are kicking this off is Infosys. So on January 27th, so in a few days from now, we have a first webinar where we talk about S/4HANA and the benefits of running SAP on Microsoft Azure. It's a joint webinar with Infosys and SAP. So also, if you look at Damian Johnson from SAP is also joining or hosting this webinar. So I think that's also definitely something very interesting to check out. Then one final thing, what I really love about this new approach from SAP is Jürgen Müller is doing another Q&A session. So Jürgen Müller, the CTO of SAP, he has done this in the past. He was very open during TechEd, and now he's offering another webinar for the community where he will answer questions. So I guess you can again chat with him, you can ask your questions, and then the topmost questions will probably be answered. So I really like this openness from SAP. I mean, similar like with the other board members, that they are very approachable. So I'm definitely looking forward to this Q&A session with Jürgen Müller here.
Me as well. So you communicate with the customers and partners. That's great. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So with these few things that we wanted to highlight, I actually want to hand over to Ralitza. So you might remember we talked about this blog, how to deploy ASCS on Azure Files with NFS. And at that time, we already hoped that we could get Ralitza to join one of our podcasts because she's obviously the expert here. So with this, Ralitza, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself, and then I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Sure. Well, first of all, hi. Thank you for having me here. As already heard, my name is Ralizta Deltcheva, and as you might have already detected by the accent, I'm not a native English speaker. I'm originally from Bulgaria. Currently, I'm a principal architect on the SAP engineering team in Azure Compute. I have been on the team for about a little bit over 2 years. Been with Microsoft close to 10, 11 years. Prior to joining the team, I've actually held various positions as a hand-on basis admin and SAP technical architect with different SAP customers ranging from large SAP implementations to smaller SAP implementations. And again, prior to joining the engineering team, I was actually for about 8-9 years on Microsoft's own basis team. So that's the team that runs Microsoft's own SAP business systems. But
so
I
you
guess,
really know what you're talking about. You used
well,
it.
I've used it. Yes,
Yes.
I have.
Operated.
I've operated it. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
But I guess enough about me. We should probably switch to the topic for today.
And maybe just a small comment is Jürgen is a kind of Santa Claus for SAP on Azure. Ralitza is Santa Clausing, for SAP on high availability, so to say in overall. So that's
okay. Okay, well, we can go with that. Yes. Okay. So the topic for today, as already mentioned earlier, is deploying SAP application layer and more specifically ASCS ERS with Azure Files. But before I jump to the topic, I just thought I'll take a moment to speak about historically what solutions we have released, and also spend some time to talk about the features with the different solutions, because that's a feedback and a question which comes up quite frequently from both colleagues and customers. So let me try to share my screen here. So hopefully that worked and you can see my screen.
I cannot see it yet. I just see your.
Probably it's coming.
Okay, let's try again.
Did you select the right window?
Let me try again. I'll just do it this way.
Yeah,
Does it look
no,
like
I can
see
see your
it?
screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So as mentioned, historically, we have released several solutions which deal with the shared files for SAP. So if we take a step back, when you're designing an SAP system and SAP system application layer for high availability, you have to provision infrastructure for shared files. And what I mean by that is the likes of SAP MNT, SAP SIT, SAP Trans, and so forth. And of course, in the context of high availability, in order not to compromise the resilience of the whole SAP system, you need to come up with a highly available solution for these shared directories and shared files. So the very first solution which was available on Azure was, and I'm talking about SAP on Linux here, of course, was to build an NFS cluster. And depending on the distro, so if you had SLES, you would build a DRBD cluster. If you happen to be a rail shop, you would do GlusterFS. And that worked, but a lot of feedback came from customers that that's complicating the architecture to some extent. And it also, to some extent, made the life of the basis admin a little bit more complicated, because now they were in a position where, in addition to operating clusters and infrastructure for the SAP application layer, they had to deal with NFS clusters. So the next solution which was released was based on NFS volumes for NetApp. And I think this diagram does a very good job to show the simplification. So with this next solution, the need to operate and maintain these NFS clusters went away. So all you need to do is very easily deploy a NetApp volume, NFS volume, and from there on, you don't have the overhead to maintain and operate this NFS cluster. And now the next solution, which is coming up, is based on another native NFS feature on Azure. That's NFS on Azure Files. As mentioned earlier, the feature is in public preview. So customers are welcome to try it, of course. And there is a very nice blog which announced the public preview for the feature. If you go to the Get Started section, there are some links which lead to documentation on how to start and how to sign up for the preview and how to enable it in your subscription. But with that being said, because it's in public preview, it is not suitable yet to be used for operating production, like real production SAP workload. So don't do that just yet. Now, as mentioned, now that we have 2 already released solutions and we have another one coming up, another question which comes from, again, colleagues and customers is, okay, so how do I choose the right option for my scenario? So the blog that we released a couple of weeks ago aims to address 2 things. First, to give an overview of the solutions and the options one has on Azure to run the SAP shared directories, and provide a summary and comparison of the different features for each one of the options. So I'm not going to drain the table completely, but just wanted briefly to touch upon on a couple of things. So in terms of simplification, compared to running NFS cluster, both NFS on ANF and NFS on Azure Files will provide the simplification for customers.
Simply they are PaaS services, so to say.
Exactly.
You just click, you don't have to operate it. And here on NFS cluster, you need to patch the Linux.
You need to patch it, you need to configure it, you want to test the high availability.
Exactly.
I mean, pretty much everything is custom.
Deploy, deploy the clustering on the top, configure it left, configure right. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, yeah.
It's quite a bit of an overhead, and that's actually a nice segue here, because when considering the cost of operating the solution, right? So with NFS cluster, in addition to the cost of the actual VMs, disks, and so forth, one would need to account for this administrative overhead for the solution. Not the case with the native NFS features. But there are also some differences between the different options. So when we talk about high availability, a question which comes up very often is about what are the options for redundancy, and there are some differences between the 2 solutions. So with Azure Files, NFS on Azure Files, you'll have 2 options. At deployment, when you deploy, you can choose between local redundancy or zonal redundancy.
Which is a bit new. Zonal redundancy is quite new, right? Yeah.
It's a new feature, yes. Yeah. With NFS on ANF, currently there is high availability built in, but it's within a single zone. And if we switch the topic now a little bit to talk about disaster recovery, then another question which comes up very quickly is, okay, so what about geo-replication? At the moment, there is no cross-regional replication offered with Azure Files, NFS on Azure Files. With ANF, NFS on ANF, you have the option to achieve that with Snap Mirror. And another thing I should mention before we move on to the gist of the solution is that so feedback from customers has come that in the case where they have smaller SAP landscapes, or when they have a situation where they choose only to deploy the SAP application layer to NFS shares, the entry bar for ANF is a bit high. The smallest you can deploy for a capacity pool is 4 TIBs. And that's not the case with NFS on Azure Files. You have a much lower entry bar here. You start from 100 GB per individual share. So that's also in an effort to address this feedback from the smaller customers and customers with smaller SAP footprint.
But I think it's important that what you showed before, that obviously with ANF, I have, for example, the possibility to really run my HANA database. So it's certified, it has the enough throughput and performance and stuff like that. But obviously, if I look at my SAP MMT or something like that, if I look at my shared files, maybe I don't even need this kind of performance. So that's, I think, where Azure Files has definitely a sweet spot that, I can just put my files there. The costs are pretty low. The availability is great. So
correct. And you can see that in the SAP use case line here. So with ANF, ANF is an excellent solution for running your HANA databases and other databases. Azure NFS on Azure Files, we are releasing or plan to release just for the SAP application layer. So no intention to release that for heavy duty database workloads.
Yeah. But I also hear, in the customer projects, many wants the zones, or go to the zonal HA. So basically that would mean the Azure File, at this moment, it's the way to go, right? If they want the zones.
Correct. If they want the simplicity and the zones, the way to go would be with NFS on Azure Files at the moment. Yeah. Correct. Now that's a good again segue to talk a little bit about the architecture with the new solution. So for those who are familiar with our already released high availability architectures for the SAP application layer, you will see some familiar elements. So you still need to have a pacemaker cluster for your ASCS, ERS instances. So you still need to have the Azure load balancer here in front of the VMs in the cluster. Obviously, you still need to deploy virtual machines to run the application instances for SAP like PAS and AS. Where the differences are is in the solution to provide the shared files. And the difference here would be obviously that you will use NFS share on Azure Files. And when you do that, there are a couple of important considerations that I would like to highlight here. So the first one is the usage of private endpoint. So when you deploy the storage account, the recommended way to deploy it for SAP workloads is with private endpoint. And that serves two purposes. When you deploy with private endpoint, and after that, when you access the shares via the private endpoint, from a security perspective, what that means is that your traffic between the compute layer and the file shares does not leave the security boundaries of the VNet. Cool. And in the SAP world, its security means a lot because SAP systems usually contain sensitive business data. So customers are very interested in secure solutions for their SAP systems. The second point I would like to make here in regards to the private endpoint is that, as mentioned, you have the option to deploy cross-zonally the application. So when you do that, naturally, when you deploy the file shares, the storage account for the file shares, you will choose ZRS as a replication mechanism. And when you do that, in the unlikely event that there is a problem with a complete zone within an Azure region, the usage of private endpoint to access the shares means that as the traffic automatically is directed to a healthy zone, you will not need to remount your shares to the VMs. So that's another important consideration to use the private endpoint. Now, I wanted to also quickly show what that looks like. So I have here a storage account which is already deployed. If you click on the networking tab, you can see that using a private endpoint connection, the private endpoint connection ties to a network interface, and this network interface obviously will map to an IP address. Now, when you deploy the storage account, you also have the option to choose integration with private DNS zone, which we do recommend. And when you deploy the private endpoint with this integration with the DNS zone, what is going to happen also is that it's going to create a record, DNS record, to map the private endpoint with the IP address. So that's how it works behind the scenes. And then, of course, to show you the shares as well. So you click on file shares, and you will see here listed the file shares that were created in this storage account. I don't know why it's taking so long currently. So maybe we'll let that, here we go. So these are the shares that were deployed in this storage account. And you can resize them on the fly. And a nice feature is that as you're changing the provisioned capacity, it will actually calculate here and show you on the side what you get as a baseline for IOPS, what is your burst limit, and what is the throughput for egress and ingress that you're going to see with the share.
So basically, the way to increase the performance is to increase the size, for example.
Correct.
And
Correct.
that would be, I hope, transparent to the running SAP system there, meaning no downtime.
Yes, no downtime. You don't need to stop SAP. You don't need to remount or do anything like that. And by the way, the same is true for using NFS volumes on ANF. So both native NFS solutions give you these options.
Can I just increase, or can I also decrease the size of my volumes?
You can decrease the size of the volumes as well, but there is a limitation. You can only decrease the size once per 24 hours. There was a warning. I don't know if you noticed when we were.
Actually, and of course, you need to have. You cannot go below your actual file size.
Of course, yes. You will not be able to do that.
Right.
Yes.
But I mean, this is actually quite interesting, because when I think if happens that there is a kind of need to burst the performance, okay, you increase it, fine, you get it. Okay, you need to wait 1 day to go back, but still you can go down and pay less, so to say. Right.
So the bursting you get on your size anyway, if you have burst credits. So you always have this option. You may find yourself in a situation where you need to increase the capacity. For instance, if you're anticipating a huge peak in the demand from a certain SAP system. So you have both options available.
So what does it mean bursting? So you have currently, let's say, a baseline, which is, I don't know, 596 IOs, and then burst you can to 4,000. So what does it mean? Is it for a certain amount of time, or the bursting, or is generally you need to resize to get these 4,000 IOPS?
You don't need to resize, but you need to have credits accumulated in order to benefit from the bursting.
Okay.
So if you have provisioned the share with the baseline, like in this case of 596 IOs, and if you have stayed within the limit for a period of time on the share, you accumulate credits. So when the need comes to have a higher IO activity on the share, you can use these bursting credits
until they are available, right?
Until you exhaust them.
Right. So, but if you need still more, then the way is to resize it for some time.
If you need more beyond of that, then you can also increase the size of the share.
Right.
Of course.
Good.
Yep. So coming back, to actually the procedure. So we spoke about the architecture, and in terms of sequence of deploying the solution. So you start with the infrastructure. We covered already the deployment of the actual storage account and the private endpoint and the shares. And then from there on, it's actually very similar to the normal procedure for deploying SAP on Azure. You obviously need to create a pacemaker cluster for your ASCS and ERS VMs. So you do that by following the standards article for setting up a pacemaker cluster. Then from there on, you have some preparation work on the VMs. You mount your shares, and by the way, here is an example of how you can mount the share using the private endpoint. So that's what I meant by accessing via private endpoint, and you do the same thing obviously in the pacemaker resources. And then you start creating your ASCS pacemaker resources, install ASCS, then you shift your attention to the Encure application instance, you create the resources, you install ERS, and then you can finish up pretty much the SAP installation. Nothing new or unusual there. Just follow the standard process for installing an SAP system. And of course, at the very end, we highly recommend to execute the failover tests for your cluster, so that you have confidence that when the need comes, your cluster will operate properly, and you're not going to end up with unnecessary, unplanned additional downtime. So I would say pretty straightforward, very similar to the other procedures for installing SAP. The big difference is in the shared files. And the blog provides very detailed step-by-step instructions on how to deploy.
Cool.
Yep.
I mean, I work with many big customers, and some are new, some are already existing. And the new one want to go to the zones, and the existing one want to move from availability set to the zones. And those who are in Linux, they wait for this. Really,
right.
Like 30% really. They really saw. I mean, there's a lot of excitement on the customer side on this. So, of course, they do it for real stuff. They do for production. They don't do for their grandmother, playing around. When we can, I mean, there is an independent from SAP. It's Azure File with NFS, and the zones is in a private preview, public preview. You publish the blog from SAP side. So can you say anything of what they could maybe expected? I mean, probably should come. I mean, if you publish the blog, so it's already you give them a finger and they will eat you. You know that. Yeah.
I would say it's coming up soon. I mean, in the spirit of full disclosure, so I'm not in the product group which does Azure NFS on Azure Files. So the precise timeline for GA for NFS on Azure Files will come from this group. I would say I would expect it to GA at some point in the first half of 2021. And from an SAP architecture perspective, what I can say is that we plan to release the official documentation and to release the architecture with NFS on Azure Files as soon as the feature GAs.
Cool. Great.
And yep.
Sorry, and then once it is GA and you release the documentation, this would then also mean that there is official support by SAP. So, or I mean, we have tested it, we know it's working, so customers could then really run their productive environment also using Azure Files on NFS.
Correct. So once the official documentation is on docs.microsoft, and I mean, in this example, the block is written for SLES, but at GA, we'll have parity for both distros, so both SLES and RHEL. Once we publish on docs.microsoft and the feature is in GA, customers can use it to operate production workloads. Yeah.
Great. Maybe just one more question or comment. Also, many customers, they're doing DR. They're using another Azure region as the DR. So on your table above, where you compare the features, basically, it's mentioned at the moment for Azure Files to use, there is no built-in feature. So our example is custom rsync. Rsync is a very popular way on a Linux world to replicate this stuff. Versus ANF, they do have a nice feature, which is in a, I believe, public preview to do replication out of the box. However, ANF, it's again not in the zone, so that would be a showstopper. Right? So I guess the current ways are sync, or meaning whatever would be the custom way to implement the replication in another DR region, right?
Yes, for now, for replicating to DR, I mean, it's either rsync or another third-party solution to replicate to the DR region, if using NFS on Azure Files.
Correct. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct.
Cool.
Well,
so
great.
hope that's really awesome, and also hope that that product group would also add this feature in a future. But this is already great. This is really, really awesome. I mean, many people are looking forward to this part as a feature, as a simplification. Really nice.
Okay, very good.
Great. Then, Ralitza, thank you very much. As Goran said, I think this is a very, very interesting topic, because it really can help you simplify the architecture that you typically need if you set up a high available SAP system. So I can only say that I'm looking forward for your next blogs. They're always very, very high quality, and maybe then after the next blog, or obviously if you have some other topics before, I think we would be very happy to have you again on the podcast.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks for the invite, and thanks for having me today, by the way.
Yes.
Sure.
Yep.
Good. Then thank you very much, everyone, and talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.